Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman. This is a fresh episode for the first one this year with Irina. So this will be a special one. This is a part of our special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman, she is an US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina, and a very happy new year to you.
Thanks, and same to you. Hope your year is off to a great start.
Wonderful, wonderful. A great start to a new year from coverage point of view. In terms of geopolitics, we will understand from you how whether it has been a great start or not. Let's look at the impact of the US UK strike on Yemen. How do we understand it? This is the big topic that we'll be covering today. So let us understand in full what is this US UK strike on Yemen? Why suddenly Yemen has come into the picture from a layman's perspective? Someone sitting, say, suppose in a village in India, how do they understand this part? Why Yemen has suddenly become the hotbed for US UK strike?
Well, that general area has always been very important. About one-fifth of the world's maritime trade passes through Bab el Mandab, Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the general Gulf of Oman area. Much of it is oil and gas that goes on to Africa and to the Far East, to Japan, South Korea, countries that are heavily dependent on imports of energy from abroad. Yemen has been a complicated country for many decades, but in the last decade, the biggest issue has been the uprising of the Iran-backed Houthis. They're a minority Muslim family that expanded significantly through complex marriage and tribal networks and through conquest. They rose up against the official government of Yemen, started a revolution that was supposed to be in favor of the greater inclusion in the government, but they have become so radicalized and so close to Iran that they actually want to have full control of Yemen, 100% of all of its territory and government. They do not want to be engaged in any power sharing agreements. Saudi Arabia was eventually invited by Yemen to help address this uprising. It led a long war of 8 years. Unfortunately, its defensive maneuvers were cut short by international diplomatic pressure. As a result, the port of Hodeidah, the biggest port in Yemen, was given over to the Houthi control, essentially, and this is where both the humanitarian aid flows into the country, and it's supposed to be distributed everywhere, but unfortunately, most of it is stolen or divided up between cronies and supporters of the Houthis. But it's also the port where Iran directs its ammunition, its weapons, and Iran, both through the RGC and Hezbollah, has trained Houthis to become an increasingly more sophisticated force. They used to be allied with the Saudis during the Cold War against the Nasser-backed Egypt and the Soviet Union, but decades later they moved closer to Iran and were engaged in assorted smuggling and criminal activity over the borders with Oman and Lebanon, and eventually became a more politicized force. They engaged in numerous skirmishes with the government and over time became quite good at war. And now they're in possession of long range and medium range ballistic missiles, various drones, both Iranian made and partially Chinese made drones, and assorted other sophisticated weapons. And they've become quite professionalized. They're more like a very serious paramilitary force similar to Hezbollah than to a group of random terrorists that you can imagine, and they've become quite adept at using the terrain of Yemen to hide their infrastructure, making it very difficult to get them through airstrikes alone. And because they control most of the populated territory in Yemen right now, ground game has also become very complicated. U.S. at one point was engaged in Yemen, but mostly in countering Al Qaeda and ISIS. They did provide support to the Saudi-led Arab coalition, mostly with logistics and intelligence. That support over time waned for political reasons. Since then, U.S. withdrew any support. The Saudis decided to engage in peace talks with the Houthis, which have so far led nowhere. But as a result of normalization with Iran, the Saudis backed away from trying to confront Houthis militarily and even asked US not to engage in any offensive activity. Since October 7th, so previously, because Houthis are an Iranian proxy, they have essentially pledged fealty to the Tehran regime, and they have become increasingly integrated and interchangeable with the various other Iran-backed militias and organizations and movements in the region. They have in the past offered the help and support to Hamas, which Hamas at the time previously had declined, and they have also provided very positive political support to the Taliban in Afghanistan. So they've become quite known in the region. They've fundraised for Hezbollah inside their own territory. After October 7th, they became Iran's most potent weapon because they were once more, where previously they focused their military strikes on Saudi Arabia and UAE, now they reoriented towards trying to get to strike Israel. And eventually, when they focused, they did manage to get close to reaching Israeli territory because they now have long-range rockets, but most of their strikes were directed at commercial ships. Israel redirected most of its traffic around Cape of Good Hope in Africa. So then they started attacking any Western vessels that pass through the region, avoiding Russian and Chinese ships, however. All of that was coordinated with Iran, that renewed its past habit of abducting oil tankers and hijacking its crews, and there was also apparent possible coordination with Somali pirates who hijacked one of the ships and were intercepted by the United and apprehended by the United States. U.S. ended up moving a number of warships to the area. Iran responded by moving spy ships there, as well as occupying local Yemeni islands that made it very difficult for U.S. to one of the U.S. warships to leave the area. So all of these continuing strikes and attacks were coordinated between Iran and Houthis, with Iran giving orders. At one point, it even had an ambassador in Sana'a, the capital occupied by the Houthis, and it became such a big problem that the Suez Canal, where much of this traffic was directed, lost 40% of its revenue. Shipping costs rose 250%. All of that obviously had an impact on energy prices, on economies of the countries most dependent on these things, and it just made freedom of navigation impossible in this highly strategic region. U.S. had warned Houthis multiple times, along with the United Kingdom and a coalition of defensive ships. They've tried striking down these missiles and drones without engaging in offensive action, but after a while it became the Houthis became engaged in deliberate provocations, pushing the envelope farther and farther. Now, the first thing that President Biden did when he came to office in terms of foreign policy was remove the Houthis from foreign terrorist organization list where President Trump um, placed them just right before leaving the White House. Now there is an ongoing discussion about redesignating them. Uh, a lot of the media today reported that they would be placed back on the FTO after President Biden called them terrorists, but former Trump officials say that Houthis will be sanctioned as a group, but not placed on that specific top level designation. Regardless, U.S. engaged in symbolic strikes. They gave the Houthis a warning about the timing of the strikes, which they claimed would prevent regional escalation. The Houthis had an opportunity to remove much of their weapons and fighters from the area, and they renewed the strikes as soon as it was over. And today, U.S. After a repeat of these strikes, after U.S. had to do a repeat run, this time specifically signaling to Iran that it's behind it. The Houthis continued nevertheless, and so today U.S. and UK engaged in a preemptive strike for the first time. But given the fact that a lot of this infrastructure is hidden deep inside the country, it's not clear what impact it's going to have. It's literally just happened today.
Right, right, Irina. In terms of Houthis, if you look at it, what is it that they want? Are they going to get anything in the long term in terms of their standing? Because the US and Iran, their relationship might change. Houthis, do they have a long term objective as a group? Also, in terms of, what is the Yemen government doing? Do they have a proper structure where they can control? Because last week when the strikes happened, Iran put it as, these attacks as violation of Yemen's sovereignty and territorial integrity and breach of international laws. Why is it that the US is not putting pressure on the Yemen government? How and earlier also the Houthis were there, and but now because of this Middle East crisis, because of the Gaza Strip and all that stuff, it has become much more. What is the Houthis' role here? Do they want a very active role into these things? Is it now how much control does Iran have? Does their existence only fully rely on Iran, or is it that they have their own agenda in that whole region?
Well, Iran has evolved its role from a regional partner to the Houthis to completely controlled. To be completely in control, they would not have started any of this without Iran's direction. And while they claim that the impetus for all of this is the war in Gaza and that they are trying to help Hamas, in reality, this is just an excuse, a justification for Iran to expand regional war, to humiliate US, to test the waters of US commitment, and to try to push US and its allies out of their area and to expand its own naval capabilities. As for the Houthis, their agenda is local power. They want to have complete control of Yemen. The legitimate Yemeni government does not recognize them. However, U.S. and Saudi Arabia have been pushing the government to include Houthis into a diverse structure. But Houthis want complete control. They don't want to power share, and they are also extremely radical. They are more radical in terms of their views than the Iranian regimes. They have essentially erased women from public space altogether, similar to what the Taliban has done, much more so than Iran. By the way, they have been killing journalists quite openly, torturing them, abducting people of various backgrounds, recruiting child soldiers, similar to what Hamas and Hezbollah and Polisario in North Africa, all Iran-linked organizations, have been doing. So they're a very extreme group, and they consider U.S. and Israel and Jews enemies to be eliminated and destroyed, and in by all means possible. Obviously, they do not have the means to really fight the United States other than through information wars, but at that they are quite adept, and they're spreading propaganda everywhere. They're brainwashing their populations. Yemen government has been part of the talks with Saudi Arabia for months. Saudi Arabia is leading that effort, but it hasn't gone anywhere because the Houthis have made ridiculous, absurd demands. They required $100 billion from the Saudis, plus they wanted all the salaries of their officials paid, and they've been smuggling oil from the south. So the situation is very complicated, very bad. There's not much US can do to put any more pressure on Yemen. They should be putting more pressure on the Houthis, but they have been reluctant to do much. They've been sanctioning financial networks that provide assistance to the Houthis, but the Houthis are still not fully designated as a terrorist organization like the RGC, Hamas, or Al Qaeda, for instance. So they still have a fair degree of international legitimacy. The officials travel back and forth, including to Iran, quite openly. Um, they follow Iran's directions because they get full support from Iran, and because they have a common goal in radicalization, taking over the country. For Iran, the ultimate goal is Saudi Arabia. They want to be seen as a primary religious state in the region. They want to dismantle the monarchy, which they do not consider as legitimate. They want to be the custodian of the two holy mosques. So there is a very doctrinal religious war going on here, and the Houthis are a means to that end. The Houthis consider themselves legitimate descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and as such, they consider themselves uh, the, the tribe that should be ruling Yemen, even though Yemen has been a republic for a long time now. They haven't had a king in a long time, but the Houthis want to go back to that structure, and they only recognize Muslim monarchs who are descended from who are Hashemite in origin, who are descended from the same tribe. So they don't have an issue with Morocco, they don't have an issue with Jordan, but they do have an issue with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so forth.
Right, Irina. In terms of the Houthis, position there, they are not attacking Chinese ships, Russian ships, and but others. Now they want to put an impact for whatever reasons it is onto the Western powers, and maybe as it looks like maybe on the because of the Israel Hamas war. But as one of our viewers has this particular question, that did the Houthis attack on the Red Sea hurt Israel and West more, or poorer countries in the region dependent on the trade? How do you look at this? Because almost every country is impacted if we look at it that way. What is your analysis? Even India came into the picture. India has nothing to do there. Even Indian aligned ships were, targeted. Indians were have to look at that. So help us understand in terms of the question that we are getting from one of our viewers is onto this, that it is impacting more poorer countries, and the world can see through it that there is a bigger agenda, and not purely in terms of purely in terms of Israel or any other thing, but much more related to political power. And this is what, again, why can't people see Houthis are doing this attack? Because of Iran and to achieve their political goals, and not because of Gazans. How do you see these sort of views? How do you see the impact on poorer countries from your point of view?
They're having quite a very limited impact on Israel, to be honest, other than optics and, just an additional annoyance. Israelis have been preparing for potential for such strikes for a very long time because they're aware of the Houthi capabilities, and it's also very far away. So even with the long-range missiles, it's still difficult to reach. Now with the traffic redirected, it's taking longer to deliver the goods, but it's inconvenience, but it's not a huge problem. The problem is with poorer countries, and it's the problem is with the commercial ships that have been damaged, and also with countries that are more dependent on oil and trade and cannot get it through other routes. But we have also seen that there is a different reason. Um, so the official reason that the Houthi stated is because they want to use the situation as a pressure on Israel to withdraw from Gaza. How is attacking some, European ships that have nothing to do with India, with Israel, and for that matter, may not even agree with what Israel is doing. That doesn't really make any sense, because yes, there's already international pressure on Israel. Yes, maybe the situation could stroke some fears among some people, but overall, everybody knows exactly what the situation is, and they understand that the Houthis should have been dealt with a long time ago, and that Iran is calling the shots, and Iran is instigating this violence, and the only reason US and UK responded is after a very prolonged period of trade disruption, because it's becoming impossible to pass through the region, and there's all sorts of other issues going. But there's another agenda besides simply galvanizing this output and showing Iran's strength, and trying to kick everyone out, and force them to choose sides. Iran attacked the Indian tanker directly, and it was the first time that it attacked from that direction. Now, quite frankly, Iranian meddling in India has been growing in recent period, but for a long time previously, the relations were fairly stable. India and Iran have had economic trade over energy, ports, in tourism, and various other projects, and India was not seen as part of this Iran's primary agenda. Iran's primary agenda was the Middle East. It wasn't India. Not that it didn't have interest there, but it was just not their primary interest. It was just focusing mostly on the Middle East and also on the West and Europe, the United States, causing problems there. But with India joining the Quad, and with India increasingly strengthening its relations with Israel and the United States, and with India becoming a global player, and we've seen the discussion of the Middle East corridor with Saudi Arabia, whatever you may call it, it's starting to become a problem for Iran as a member of the coalition, not because of it's specifically targeting Iran in any way, politically, or getting involved in any anti-Iran action. Simply as a member of this alliance, as an important potential member, because of its resources, because of its sheer size and important political role, it's being seen as a problem. And this attack on the ship was a signal. It was a strategic communication to say, choose your sides carefully, otherwise you'll be suffering along with the other countries. You could be like China and Russia, who can pass without any problems, or you could be like these Western ships. So you need to think. That's the message that Iran is sending India. Choose your sides. You can be with us in BRICS, or you could be with the West, but you can't be with both. And we're going to see a lot more of that sooner, because India is trying to play an independent political role. It is working on various projects with BRICS countries, but it's also doing a lot both on the security and economic business fronts with the US, NATO countries, and so forth. So we will see that there will be this effort to pressure India to choose sides.
Right, right, Irina. In terms of Russia, in terms of China, how should we look at their role in the Middle East, role in this Houthis, role that they are playing in the Red Sea? How should we look at that? That is also becomes then it becomes apparent about if their ships are not getting attacked, and if they is it they are who instigating them, or is it that they're trying to give tacit support only?
Well, no, I would say that the support is more than tacit. Russia, China, and Iran have absolutely a military alliance. They've done multiple military trainings, including naval exercises. Both the three of them in pairs, and also they've done things with North Korea as well. And China, as I've said, supplied engines and drones and various parts for Houthi ammunition. It's also sold weapons all over the Middle East, as have Russia. And Russia's had a role. Both Russia and China were two of the only countries with the remaining, at one point, embassies open in Yemen. Russia, at one point, has tried to play all sides in Yemen because it wanted to be seen as a power broker. It had ambitions for a military base there. Ultimately, it sided with the Houthis over the legitimate government and certainly against the Saudi elements quite openly. They've grown significantly closer to Iran and found it helpful to coordinate their actions. They have their differences. One of their differences is over particular Yemeni islands that Russia has an interest in and Iran has occupied, as I've mentioned, and that they also have interest over UAE because UAE and Iran have also disputes over some islands, and Russia has sided with the UAE because they have very significant financial investments in the UAE and they need the access to the Gulf as part of their geopolitical agenda, economic agenda. So sometimes it's been difficult for them to navigate these relationships, but they have tried to kind of retain access to all of these parties to foster economic and political relationships with them and overall to join them firmly in the anti-Western agenda. With China, the situation is a little bit different. China does not play as much of a security role directly. They actually try to stay out of all these external skirmishes. Most of their military activity has been focused on South China Sea, but they have built a base in Djibouti. They've been looking to build another base in Africa with limited success due to US pressure. They've been looking to, they have had an interest in Syria and building up their military presence. They've been working on projects in Saudi Arabia and especially in UAE as well, military drone production and so forth. So, but still for them, it's more of a power projection and economic interest and political interest more than an interest in direct military involvement. They are not at the stage when they are ready to project that much power externally because their main focus is Taiwan, closer areas, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, not necessarily the Middle East, other than through political and economic pressure. Still, they find it to be an important alliance. They have a top trading relationship in terms of oil with Iran. They have a growing trade, energy trade relationship with Saudi Arabia as well. They've been selling surveillance technology all over the Middle East, particularly to Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they find it important to show this sort of backing in this avenue, and in turn, Iran gives them and Russian ships preferential treatments because they're allies. They are allies, even if they have different agendas, sometimes complementary, sometimes completely independent of each other, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes divergent, or even potentially clashing in the future. At the moment, the big task is to oppose the West, and for that reason, you are also seeing Russia and China meddling with Hamas, showing support to Hamas, now to the Houthis, not because necessarily they need, they want to be the best friends, but they find them useful against the West and to achieve their own goals.
Right, Irina. So where does this all seem to be going? Is it all related to the Middle East at the moment, or is it beyond that? Yeah, the whole world, almost half of this world is moving towards elections this year, Russian elections, India elections, US elections, Taiwan elections just ended, and China has all its own problems to deal with. So how do you see this problem moving out? Is it going to end with with the end of the fight in Gaza? Is it going to end with the end of fight with Russia and Russia and Ukraine? Some sort of a decision comes in. How does this all look like to be panning out? Will the world see more stability in the going days forward? Because Iran has just the latest is that Iran has had its own strikes in Iraq as well as in Syria. So does this look like to be much more getting wider, or is it going to be much more peaceful going forward? How does it look to you in 2024?
I think we are going to see a lot more skirmishes, a lot more efforts to push the envelope. China is watching closely. They were hoping for a political win, because that would save them the trouble of having to plan any military operations. They will still try to push the new government, the DPP government, um, against any full independence as much as possible. They've already gotten a win from President Biden, who said he opposes Taiwan's independence, and certainly many other countries around the world, for various political reasons, view Taiwan as an issue of China's territorial integrity. But I think that's going to change, because I think sooner or later people will see that for China it's not just about Taiwan. Taiwan is only a first step, just as Ukraine is an important first step for Russia. And quite simply, I don't see much of a political difference between those two countries. Russia does not see Ukraine as an independent state, even though Ukraine has had a separate government. Yes, it has had various close relations with Russia over decades, a lot of intermingling. There's been Russian influenced parties, but overall, it's been an independent country with its own separate economy, politics, and social issues and trajectories. Similarly, Taiwan has not been any real part of China in so many decades that it's completely different society, and culturally, it has some historic similarities, but also a great deal of difference because of a very different political system, democratic, much more open, much more accountable, and much more pro-Western in many ways. And China is very much moving in a different direction. So I see that China will be watching closely and seeing how it can coordinate some sort of an effort. I think if it sees that there is a real possibility of a regional conflagration in the Middle East, if Iran, Houthis, and so forth succeed in blocking the navigation completely, if they see US becoming more embroiled in having to develop a strategy to respond to these threats, unsuccessful, most likely for the time being, because this administration still is hoping for some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough with Iran, whatever that means. And while Iran is also, by the way, pursuing its nuclear ambitions, China, it will be a good time for China to take action, either by blocking the South China Sea in a similar manner as what Iran is trying to do, or by simply attacking Taiwan or Philippines, or engaging in some sort of asymmetrical hybrid warfare that may stop short of a full confrontation with Western militaries, but will certainly stretch them thin. The more conflicts there are that U.S. Needs to respond to in some way, the easier it is to start new conflicts and for each aggressor to kind of succeed and make moves, because there's only so much that U.S. can be doing diplomatically in terms of strategically providing weapons, paying attention, gathering intelligence and so forth. After all, the resources are finite, and there's also been a lot of mistakes made over the years, a lot of talent lost, and not enough people recruited specifically for all these separate and growing tasks. So I think there is going to be, a greater chance, because I don't see this administration taking any really big, daring steps against any one of these parties. And I think a blow to any one of them would be send a very strong message to the rest. This is why we are seeing North Korea actively dismantling its communications infrastructure with South Korea. This is a signal that they are, besides the usual, testing of missiles and so forth that we are all used to, they are now actually moving towards unfreezing the conflict and towards a potentially a hot phase, because this is a good time. There's only so many conflicts. Yes, Venezuela and Guyana. Venezuela is, threatening to grab a chunk of that. Various conflicts in Africa. So the overall picture is all of these fires are being instigated. Russia, China are certainly stoking these tensions. It's in their interest to do so. Iran is galvanizing its proxies and throwing everything it can to see what sticks. They are not necessarily committed to any one proxy. Hamas for them is not an end game. Houthis for them are not an end game. Yemen even is not an end game. For them, the end game is Saudi Arabia. For them, the end game is access to Eastern Mediterranean. For them, the end game is extreme level of influence throughout Europe. But all of these proxies are tools. So they are thinking what they are able to sacrifice at the moment and how they can get read the US and UK and other allies response and where they can engage and find an opening.
Right, Irina. One last question about India. What are the options here for, say, a neutral country like India? How do you see that? How do you see India's role till now? And how do you think what is the best way India can look at its interests in that region without looking to take sides much?
Well, for the time being, it has not yet come to a point where it needs to necessarily actively choose, although it's going to be pushed by all sides to do so. But it will need to take steps to actively, first of all, protect its interests from immediate tactical assaults, and we have seen it already doing so by sending warships into Indian Ocean. It will probably be engaging in more active exercises with other members of the Quad. Probably will be looking to discuss a greater intelligence and security and defense coordination bilaterally as well with various countries. Probably looking towards more advanced technologies, more advanced training. I think eventually it will need to start shifting towards more Western weapon system and away from the Russian systems, simply due to quality and amount. Um, India and the former Soviet Union have been close for historic reasons. They have been very dependent on each other in terms of these systems. But today, India is a country of a billion, nearly a billion and a half people. Russia simply does not have what it takes to supply what needs to be in the field of modern warfare. We have seen that the war in Ukraine has exhausted its capabilities. It's significantly stretched by the sanctions. It is barely able to provide for its own war. It will not be able to produce, practically speaking, the amount of various highly advanced technologies that India will need if it wants to become a very modern superpower. And that's where I think it's leading. So it will have to look to diverse other countries, mostly Western countries. It will need to restructure its military to comply with the demands of operating in this very advanced and hybrid threat environment. That's simply a practical reality, not for any ideological reasons, but because that's where it's all heading. It will probably draw a great deal on Brazil capabilities, another BRICS member with very highly advanced technology. But also it's been working with France, with Israel. Probably eventually it will get to the point where US will be able to sell its technology. President Trump made a mistake, in my opinion, strategically, because it demanded that either India would shift completely to all of American weapons or not at all. That's not, practicable for anybody in that position. Hopefully, in future administrations will be more practically minded with that respect. But regardless, that trend is likely to persist. Economically, it has been experimenting with different financial systems and its interest, and I think the market ultimately just will show what option is winning. So far, the going off trade in rupees has not worked out that well. It's a combination of different currencies has is one possibility, but if India wants to distance itself from China, it will probably want to rely on something other than yuan for the time being. And China's economy is not very stable at the moment, and probably will continue to be even less so if it continues with the current course of action. So it may have to kind of figure out where it wants to go, but this financial ish aspect is something it will have to look at if it wants to protect its interests. I think it's trying hard to balance these relationships, but a lot of it means also transitioning from away from some towards others. And I think eventually, states with other geopolitical ambitions, such as China, will make it impossible not to make that choice. When that's going to be exactly, I don't know. In the past week, we have seen China launch a miniature, an experimental charm offensive by publishing a positive op-ed about Prime Minister Modi and about India's governance in its propaganda, but in reality, it would take a lot more than that to improve relations. And quite frankly, I think they're geopolitical rivals. They're not going to be able to occupy the same space simultaneously with very competing and different visions of the future. And I don't think China's current leadership is amenable to any sort of compromise. I think they want to be number one and the only one. Whether it's India or the United States or anybody else. So I think India will probably be strengthening its relations with other Indo-Pacific countries, especially we're seeing growing relations with Japan. We will probably see a lot more with South Korea as well, a lot more in terms of technology space, communications space. There's also growing bilateral relations with Middle Eastern countries such as UAE. A lot of investments flowing back and forth. So that sort of diversification is going to happen. I think there's also evidence of India looking to expand its economic reach into Africa. So it already has a significant bridge there, but I think it will look to build on that foundation in light of critical minerals, in light of investments, in light of defense interest and trade of that sort. So we will probably see a lot of that going on, and all without necessarily any direct confrontations. But what India does voluntarily, which is all these things that I see already happening, does not mean that adversarial actors will be content with just letting it move ahead at its own pace without bothering anybody. I think we will see that there will be various unwelcome moves to force it to make that choice, and I think India needs to be prepared for it. I think its allies, historical allies of convenience and otherwise, may not be ready to share India with others, and I think that will come at a point where India will be forced to shift away. I know that there's a big point about being independent, but I think part of being independent is also understanding who your allies are and who are countries that want to limit your interests based on their own concerns in a very hostile way. I think those pragmatic decisions will be made when the time comes.
Well explained. Well explained. It is indeed a very difficult world, a different world than it was some years back, and all countries will need to be prepared for this. And as it happens, we will continue to get your analysis to the audience. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Tsukerman. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.